In 2004, a 7-year-old boy in Chile stumbled across something that countless 7-year-old boys all over the globe could only have dreamt of: a dinosaur bone. It was just a vertebra and a bit of rib, and if that had been the end of it, he'd have gone down as one of the youngest discoverers of some random unknown dinosaur. But as it happens, this find was part of an almost entirely complete skeleton, and a skeleton that nobody had ever seen before. It has since been described as the dinosaur equivalent of a platypus. Today we're looking at one of the strangest dinosaurs known to science, and why it threw so many spanners in the works of dinosaur phylogeny. We'll go through many ideas of what it may have been, and we'll finish up with a hint of what it actually was. First, let's look at what we know. Diegosuarezi was the lucky little boy that found the first skeleton. It had the majority of its skull, most of the ribs, an arm and a leg, hips, shoulders, and spine. It was really only missing the tail. This specimen was estimated to have been under 2 meters long, but subsequent finds place its adult size at around 3 meters. It was found in sediment from the late Jurassic, laid down 147 million years ago. This was a location in which only sauropods had previously been found, but ironically, Chilesaurus, as the animal came to be known, is the only dinosaur specimen from that region that has actually been identified. There are other non-dinosaur fossils from this space and time, though. Fossils of the crocodilomorph Brachiosuchus, a transitional species between the terrestrial and semi-aquatic pseudoseuchians, have also shown up in this formation. The basic stats on this animal are nothing to get excited about. This was a 3-meter-long bipedal animal with shorter front arms and a slightly longer neck. It had a long tail used as a counterweight, and it was originally thought to have eaten meat, like other theropods. Its silhouette certainly resembles a slightly misshapen theropod. So what made this dinosaur so unusual? Well, on closer inspection, nothing about it makes sense. It's bipedal like a theropod, but its thick shin bones and load-bearing toe indicates that it wasn't built for running. In fact, its limb bones are all very stout, and its feet are flatter, similar to the Sauropodomorphs. And its forelimbs weren't nubby little afterthoughts like many theropods, but they were also dense and adorned with 2 short, grasping claws. Now, it's important to note that while Sauropodomorphs are best known for their titanic quadrupedal ambassadors, the basal members of this group match this description quite well. Panphagia is the most basal of the Sauropodomorphs known, and this showed up in the late Triassic as a biped, and as its name suggests, it would have been an omnivore. Like Chilesaurus, Panphagia would have also had quite a long neck, and they both had relatively small heads, which is definitely a more sauropodomorph thing than the predatory theropod cousins. And its teeth were not for eating meat. Instead, they jutted out like flat, spatula, plant-munching teeth, similar to those you'd find in the incisors of a goat. Okay, so you'd think that it was a basal sauropodomorph. That's not particularly weird, right? But it gets weirder. Its hips were distinctly bird-like, as we see in the Ornithischian dinosaurs like Triceratops and Stegosaurus. And it wore its pelvis bone back to front, which is likely an adaptation to having a great big belly. Great big bellies are often brewing chambers for fermenting and digesting plant matter, and the teeth of Chilesaurus were perfectly designed for sending such mashed-up fodder into something just like this. And like Triceratops and the steg, it probably had a beak. So now we have 3 distinct dinosaur lineages to choose from: the Ornithischians, the Theropods, and the Sauropodomorphs, and this dinosaur has attributes of each of them. This is exactly why Chilesaurus has been referred to as a platypus dinosaur, and the people responsible for classifying dinosaurs aren't having much more luck at it than the general public either. The bird hips are typically a dead giveaway. Evolution doesn't like to make massive changes, so flipping a hip bone completely around is a lot less likely to happen than, say, gradually morphing neck bones to be longer or shorter. So intuition would suggest that the hip is one of the strongest indications that Chilesaurus was an Ornithischian. In 2017, that's exactly what was suggested, and the idea that this dinosaur was a basal Ornithischian then sent a cascade of changes throughout the dinosaur phylogeny world. Up until that point, Sauropodomorphs and Theropods had long been assumed and formally classified as a shared clade of their own, which excluded the Ornithischians. But now Ornithischians and Theropods were being proposed as the closer relations. This gets a little tricky, so let's take a look at a bit of the history and put it into perspective. In 1870, a man with formidable sideburns called Thomas Huxley identified that many dinosaurs have legs that are similar to modern birds. He created a group of bird-legged dinosaurs called Ornithischian. This excluded the sauropods, whose legs are at the very least not bird-like, and who were at the time thought to have been more closely related to the crocodilian line. But judgments in those days were extremely subjective, and knowing what we do now about convergent evolution, such a basic system of visual similarities or homologies was critically limited. A little later in 1887, a new approach was set up by a guy with what is basically the inverse of the facial hair of Huxley, Harry Seeley, split dinosaurs into two different groups, the Saurischians, containing theropods and the sauropods, and the Ornithischians, with pretty much everything else. This decision came from the hips, which were argued to have been persistently inherited, and therefore very reliable as indicators of relationships. While this was still a very primitive approach by today's standards, modern cladistics backed it up. Morphological cladistics basically looks at potential groupings of dinosaurs or other animals, and it finds similarities in the morphology of their members. But then it looks at how many times these similarities would have to have been independently evolved for them to fit together. Since similarities from convergent evolution happen a lot less frequently than inherited similarities, the groupings with the lowest number of cases is said to have the highest parsimony, and therefore is most likely to be the accurate one. Using this approach, the conclusion was that theropods and sauropods could indeed be grouped together, with Ornithischians being a third, more distant branch. This was a powerful hypothesis, and it lasted all the way up until this troublemaking Chilesaurus showed up. So, what changed? In 2017, a paper by Barron, Norman, and Barrett used over 400 of these morphological characteristics from a whole bunch of basal dinosaurs from the early days of their reign in the late Triassic and early Jurassic. Their conclusion tipped everything on its head. Theropods were now regrouped with Ornithischians again. In part, this would go some way to explaining what Chilesaurus was, a basal Ornithischian. The argument against it being a Sauropodomorph again comes from this backwards hip, which were absent in ancient sauropods. Incidentally, the paper also suggests that this lack of a reversed hip may explain why sauropods ended up quadrupedal in the first place. If the reversed hip bones moved over to give way for a giant fermenting gut, this would allow a bipedal animal to remain bipedal, but if they didn't, perhaps the only way to increase gut size is to tip over until you can't stand up anymore. And speaking of large guts, we really appreciate being able to work sitting down to help make these videos for you. And your support is critical to allowing us to keep doing that. So if you're enjoying this content, please help us out by liking the video and subscribe to the channel. We really appreciate your engagement in the comments too. So after all of this, is it clear what exactly Chilesaurus was? Not really. First of all, this change is still a bit controversial, not least in its use of resurrected terminology to mean different things than its original meaning, which deeply adds to confusion. And this isn't likely to get any easier simply from going over the data more. It appears as though a point has been reached where more analysis just isn't going to cut it. There's simply a lack of bones to fill in the gaps and to come to a solid conclusion from. But that's good news, because it means that we should get more people digging holes and finding more dinosaurs. So while the exact position on the phylogenetic tree isn't yet settled, Chilesaurus are now generally recovered as theropods, but they're also sometimes still placed as basal Ornithischians, which just goes to show what a mess this phylogeny can be in general, but especially when you don't have the luxury of molecular phylogenetic assessments that you would have in remains that can still contain DNA. But one arrangement of all these animals from 2018 hints at something very interesting. Not only does it group Chilesaurus in the theropod clade, but it groups all of the dinosaurs with known feathering and known beaks together. So there's a fourth group of dinosaurs that Chilesaurus shares some feature with. This is actually a subgroup of the theropod, called tetanurans, and it contains all of the theropods more closely related to birds than carnosaurs. Chilesaurus was originally placed here, then it was moved around all over the place, and now it is either within this group or a sister taxon to it, according to the 2018 paper. So if Chilesaurus was inside Tetanuranae, there's a chance that it's basal to all avian theropods, which makes it one of the most significant finds in recent history. And even if it isn't, the upheaval that this single strange species of dinosaur has caused to the scientific understanding of dinosaur phylogeny still makes it hugely significant. Chilesaurus, from its few finds, appears to have been very strange and very isolated, and it didn't have a very wide range. But there's still so much to figure out about it. Meanwhile, it'll stay as one of the most jumbled and confused morphologies of any dinosaur species known, perhaps even more unusual than the outstanding Therizinosaurus, which, by the way, we also have a video on, so please check that one out after this. As for this one, it's all over for now, and as frustrating as it might be to end with so much uncertainty, this also highlights the ever-growing body of unknowns that we're so desperate to find the next generation of paleontologists to chip away at. See you next time.